There is a chest in the western vault, bound in green-black bronze and fitted with 7 locks, though only 3 of them still agree on what closed means. Its wood was taken, so an old inventory insists, from a cedar felled in the Tetherian uplands, before Shoon had yet learned to call itself inevitable. Its fittings were recast in Kalimport. Its hinges were replaced in Memnon. Its bottom boards were repaired with timber from a river barge burned during some provincial quarrel no imperial clerk thought worth naming. The thing is less a chest than an argument assembled out of conquered places. When opened, it releases the faint odor of salt, hot dust, old perfume, lamp soot, and parchment kept too near iron. Inside are signet rings cracked at the bezel, wax tablets of tax tallies, custom seals from vanished harbours, lists of troop levies written in 3 different hands over 200 years, and rolls of silk wrapped around bundles of legal claims that outlived the officials who stamped them. Empires do that. They gather the world as proof of themselves, then leave behind containers full of other people's labor and call the collection order. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Belnorn Law Warden, keeper of old roads, old courts, old harbours, old oaths, and the less flattering truths great powers prefer to hide beneath processional music. This is the Lich's tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. We remain in the 2nd season, Realms Between Ruins, the long age of kingdoms. In the 1st season, we followed the grand sweep from contradictory creation stories through the creator races, tearfall dragons and giants, the first flowering of the elves, the long catastrophe of the crown wars, the making of the drow, the founding time, dwarven ages beneath the mountains, Imaskar and the theft of peoples, Netheril's impossible ascent and annihilation, Mithranna's luminous wager, factions that outlived states, the time of troubles, the blue fire of the spell plague, and the Second Sundering's hard-won breathing space. We asked how Faerûn became Faerûn. This season asks who inherited it. So far, we have refused the nursery lie that later kingdoms rose upon empty land. We looked upon the founding time and said, no, these realms are not first builders. They are heirs, scavengers, interpreters, trespassers, preservers, looters, and sometimes all of these by noon. We studied Jamdath, where disciplined thought itself became civic power, and where psionics shaped an empire not of floating enclaves or openly divine kingship, but of trained minds ordered into institutions. Then we turned to Mulhorand and Unther, where Mulan's survivors and their descendants became founders of states in which the divine was not a distant abstraction, but administration, labor, law, and ritual hierarchy. Last time, we walked south into Kalimshan and found a civilization so old that conquest altered the regime more easily than the civilization beneath it. Streets, titles, perfumes, markets, slave lots, and old shames all persisted. History there was not outside the city. History was the city. And now, my patient apprentice, we come to what that depth of civilization can produce when prestige hardens into program. Tonight we enter the Shoon Imperium. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. A good site, like a good archive, should not collapse because its maker confused ornament with structure. Nor should it require necromancy to update a contact form. Choose craft over clutter, foundations over vanity, and systems that can survive ordinary mortal use. Empires rarely learn that lesson in time. Competent developers sometimes do. Calimshan, as we learned, is older than many northern imaginations can comfortably bear. It was old before 1,000 lesser thrones learned to flatter themselves with ancestry. It was old before most of the men who later claimed to rule it could even formulate a proper scheme. But age does not protect a civilization from ambition. Indeed, in some lands, it fertilizes it. The older and richer a political culture becomes, the more resources it offers to anyone clever enough, ruthless enough, and patient enough to turn continuity into leverage. Shoon is not Calimshan entire. That distinction matters. Calimshan is a civilization, long, layered, internally contradictory, and capable of surviving forms of defeat that would erase younger realms. Shoon is a dynasty and an apparatus, an imperial overlay, a long attempt to formalize dominance over lands that were already inhabited, already ruled, already remembering themselves. If you confuse the two, you commit the same error empires commit in reverse. They mistake the apparatus for the world. The world usually outlives the apparatus. The Shoon Imperium, in its broadest and most forceful centuries, dominated much of south and western Faerûn from 27 DR to 450 DR. Its heart lay in Calimshan and Tethyr, and its authority extended across lands that later generations would know as parts of Amn and beyond. The capital was Shoonach, that vast and terrible imperial complex whose ruins later generations approached with equal parts greed, scholarly hunger, and very sensible dread. Its rulers bore the style Kisar or Kisara when a woman held the throne, a title better rendered as overlord of kings than king among equals. Even the word tells you something. It presumes that ordinary kingship has already been surpassed. But to understand why the Shoon Imperium matters, we must begin before the imperial title, before the processional banners, before the capital's great clustered mass of palaces and granaries and slave enclosures and administrative courts. We must begin with a man whose genius was not merely magical. Akbar Shoon the Elder is one of those figures history produces when an old society has become stratified enough that talent can still rise, but only if it learns how to wear deference like a ceremonial robe while sharpening knives behind it. He was no rustic conqueror from beyond the frontier. He came from a minor branch of a noble family with a habit of producing talented wizards. Such details matter. Families train appetites as diligently as they train heirs. A household that breeds arcane skill without commensurate rank does not produce modest people. It produces frustration with excellent posture. In his youth, Akbar became the apprentice of Rinda Ithal, a wizard princess of Tethyr, and spent years in Miratma under her instruction. There are many ways to study a neighboring realm. One may invade it, one may trade with it, one may marry into it, one may apprentice beneath its crown's magic and learn quietly how its court breathes. Akbar chose the method available to an ambitious man who understood that knowledge of another state's internal grammar is often worth more than any fort one might seize on a border. When that apprenticeship ended, he went to Kalimport and did what clever, hungry men so often do in old, wealthy port cities. He sold his gifts. He turned skill into reputation. reputation into invitations, invitations into intimacy, and intimacy into access. Kalimport was already a place where wealth and status circulated through layered courts, patronage networks, merchant households, port authority, noble rivalry, priestly influence, and magical service. To rise there required more than sorcery. It required reading the desires of those already seated above you and making yourself useful to them until usefulness became indispensability. He ingratiated himself at the court of the Sil Pasha Kadar el-Tarsaj, married into the ruling family, and as part of that ascent, gained the post of Sil Vizar of Memnon. Again, do not race past such offices as though they were decorative. In the south, titles are often machines. A city office is not merely a compliment. It is access to taxes, petitions, guards, trade traffic, civic dependency, and networks of obligation. It is a lever disguised as a cushion. By the time later chroniclers call him the architect of the Shoon Imperium, Akbar had already done the truly difficult part. He had learned how to place his family where succession, administration, and local grievance could be bent toward one design. His route into control of Tether was not an epic open conquest sung by bards drunk on cavalry. It was worse. It was court manipulation, dynastic murder, and strategic kinship. The Shoon rise reminds us of a truth that later romantic histories dislike because it is insufficiently colorful. Many realms are lost at table long before they are lost on the field. A marriage, a poisoning, an arranged succession, a cultivated dependency in one office, and a compromised garrison in another. These do more enduring work than a glorious charge. Glory fades quickly. Documentation lingers. Tether, before Shoon domination, already possessed its own royal traditions, clan memories, and political dignity. That too matters. The Shoon story is not one of building order in a vacuum. It is one of seizing existing order and persuading later scribes to remember the seizure as inevitability. At Akbar's behest, members of Tether's ruling line were eliminated and his descendants placed upon its throne. The pattern repeated with grim familial efficiency. Grandchildren who would not serve were replaced. Grandchildren who died inconveniently made room for more pliable or better protected kin. One grandson, set on the Tetherian throne, proved reluctant to remain a puppet and was poisoned. Another followed. At last came Amal Shoon III, and by then the old architect's design was ready. When Akbar died in 27 DR, after a life extended by magic and sharpened by relentless will, Amal Shoon III inherited Kalimshan in addition to Tether. The two thrones, brought together by accumulated intrigue, could now be named as one imperial fact. Amal crowned himself Kisar. The Shoon Imperium had begun. Notice, if you please, what kind of beginning this is. Not a people on an empty plain, not a young nation's first founding, not the honest brutality of two armies meeting in dust and deciding which banner survives sunset. No, an old civilization and a neighboring kingdom welded together by administrative capture, dynastic engineering, murder, fear, and the magical prolongation of ambition. The result is not less imperial because it began in paperwork and bedrooms. It is more so. Anyone can seize a gate. It takes a more patient predator to seize a succession. This is why I call Shoon an empire by habit. From the very first generation, It normalizes the idea that lands, households, and institutions exist to be folded into a single dynastic design because power has already grown accustomed to that folding. Once such a design succeeds, it begins manufacturing its own justification. Courts adapt, nobles reposition themselves, priests recalculate, merchants ask what new roads and immunities may be purchased. Clerks revise ledgers. The conquered are told that resistance is disorder, and the ambitious are told that service is civilization. Thus does a coup, given time and enough scribes, become a dynasty. Shoon III, first Caesar of the Imperium, moved the throne and court to Shoonak. That choice deserves more attention than many summaries give it, because capitals are among the clearest confessions states ever make. Kalimport was ancient, wealthy, unruly, maritime, saturated with competing interests, and too deeply itself to become a pure instrument of any one dynasty. To rule from such a city is to negotiate daily with forces older than your reign, harbour magnates, old noble houses, merchant compacts, priesthoods, street powers, guild traditions, local custom, and the sheer centrifugal force of a metropolis that knows how to outlast its masters. Kalimport could enrich an empire magnificently. It could also remind emperors that they were not the only fact in the realm. Shoonak was different. Built near the older site of Iltakar, in a region already saturated with prior histories, Shoonak was not merely a city, but a capital complex, a deliberately planned concentration of imperial function. Here again, the season's governing truth returns. Even the imperial capital was not raised on innocence. The site had earlier associations reaching back into deep Kalishite and Tetherian antiquity, and deeper still into dwarven labor beneath the surface. Ancient pumps from High Shanatar continued even in later ages to raise water from below. Imagine the symbolism, if you like. Human emperors crowning themselves on a site whose viability depended in part upon works not of their making, built by a people their own chronicles rarely centered except when trade, war, or treasure required it. That is Faerûn entire in miniature. Shoonak's clustered districts told the truth of the empire more plainly than any coronation oath. There was the imperial city, with palaces, luxury apartments, offices for clerks, courts, ceremonial spaces, and all the administrative chambers required to convert command into routine. There was Mamlukar, the so-called slaves' village, explicitly devoted to housing the enslaved population required to maintain and serve the capital. There were granary towns and agricultural stretches, the Fediajar, folded into the greater urban whole to feed the beast. There was Agis, the port district that connected the capital to riverine shipping. There was the Palace Mount itself, the seat from which the Kaisars looked out over the machinery of dominion. There were underlevels, sewers, controlled access, walls, distribution networks, planned avenues, and the grim elegance of an environment designed not just for splendor, but for legibility. What is a planned capital? It is an admission that a state wishes to see, count, channel, and command. Shoonak therefore differed from the great old port cities not only in age, but in purpose. Kalimport accumulated. Shoonak was arranged. Kalimport knew the improvisations of commerce, crime, and layered memory. Shoonak was made to render empire orderly to itself. Grain could be tallied, slaves could be housed and distributed, offices could correspond, envoys could be processed, Nobles could be ranked spatially, troops could be quartered, roads could be directed toward a center whose geometry already presumed obedience. If you have ever wondered how an empire turns abstraction into stone, look at such a capital. And notice another thing. Shoon's very magnificence was purchased by concentration. To feed, water, guard and ornament, so large and so centralized a seat of power required the continuous pull of labor, produce, taxes, captives and specialized service from elsewhere. Such capitals are never sustained by their own beauty. They are sustained by 1,000 lesser places, losing something slowly and often invisibly, in order that the center may glitter convincingly. This is why ruins matter. A ruined capital is not only a broken city. It is a record of what an empire required from the living world around it. In Shoon, the requirements were plain enough. A city district for slaves is not a metaphor, it is policy. Dwarven waterworks beneath human palaces are not romance. They are inheritance converted into utility. Vast offices for scribes are not mere bureaucracy. They are the empire's memory of itself, or at least its preferred version thereof. Granary belts within the capital complex do not speak of elegance. They speak of scale and appetite. There are listeners I know who enjoy ruins primarily as adventure sites. The fallen city, the undercrypt, the sealed archive, the broken aqueduct, the rumor of treasure beneath the old palace. Very well. Faerûn has always had room for such appetites. But if you walk such a place honestly, you must ask more than where the secret door is. You must ask what kind of political order required this much storage, this many barracks, this much enclosed labor, this much accountancy, this much architectural insistence. The answer, in Shoon's case, is empire not as flash of conquest, but as continuous administration backed by force. That is a colder thing than glory. It is also more durable until it collapses, at which point its ruins are correspondingly vast. Let us dwell a little longer on administration, for there lies the real marrow of the episode. Conquest is dramatic. Administration is historical. Realm school boys, and regrettably some adults who ought to know better, tend to remember empires by maps colored too broadly, by lists of famous rulers, by decisive battles, by outrageous atrocities, and by the dimensions of capitals whose ruins now attract reckless treasure hunters. Yet an empire is not made by proclamation alone. It is made by offices repeated across distance until those offices begin to feel natural. The Shoon Imperium relied upon the already old Kalishite world of pashas, visas, governors, city elites, merchant magnates, military officials, and court wizards, then bent that world toward imperial coordination. This is what old civilizations do when they imperialize successfully. They do not destroy every prior structure. They standardize enough of it to make extraction predictable. A tax collected through familiar local hands is often more reliable than one demanded by a foreign captain who cannot pronounce the district's name. A noble house coerced into serving the empire may become more effective than one publicly destroyed, provided its ambition can be redirected toward imperial prestige. So the Shoon rulers created layers rather than simplicity. Kingship remained in subordinate or transformed forms. Provincial elites were not abolished so much as subordinated. Cities retained distinctive temperaments, but were threaded into wider roads, levee systems, commercial routes, military expectations, and ceremonial hierarchies. Military roads built for campaigns did not cease to exist when the campaign ended. They became arteries of trade. Port duties did not merely fill a local treasury. They fed a larger imperial appetite. Titles granted by the center became desirable because they could be exchanged for land, rank, immunity, or access. This is why the empire continued even under rulers who were not extraordinary. Shoon I, the son of Amal III, who began the family tradition of letting the dynastic name stand as regnal identity, was by most accounts an ineffectual ruler. History remembers little brilliance in him. Yet during his reign, the Imperium built major roads. Intended for armies, they became trade routes of enduring value. That is empire by habit in its purest expression. A mediocre sovereign may still advance imperial power if the institutions around him know how to continue the work. Clerks still draft orders, engineers still quarry stone, quartermasters still move provisions, merchants still adjust to new infrastructure, peripheral elites still seek favor. Armies still require movement. A system once sufficiently built can survive temporary mediocrity because the incentives embedded in it keep producing expansionary behavior. Think of the mentality that roads create. A road first cut for legions tells merchants that passage may be possible. It tells local rulers that the center can reach them faster than before. It tells caravan masters where inns, stations, wells and guards will eventually accumulate. It tells thieves where prey will travel and therefore where bribery or counter-bribery will become profitable. It tells priests where pilgrims may be guided, taxes collected, shrines established, and doctrines spread. It tells migrants where movement can occur with some hope of success. It tells empire, above all, that distance has been reduced to something billable. Roads civilize nothing by themselves. They merely permit more kinds of people to arrive sooner. Under the Shoon Imperium, such roads linked conquest and commerce so tightly that the distinction between soldier culture and merchant culture began to blur. Merchants profited from secure movement and imperial standardization. Soldiers required the surplus merchants helped generate. Port officials and tax clerks became as necessary to imperial durability as captains. A frontier fort without supply is a tomb. A harbor without military backing is an invitation. An empire that pretends trade and coercion are separate usually ends by lying first to itself and then to its provinces. The Wilhon Reach, as we saw last episode, makes trade and war wear similar robes at the city-state scale. Shoon does something slightly different. It folds them into the same imperial schedule. Roads for armies become caravan routes, garrisons become market guarantees, customs houses become intelligence posts, tributary arrangements become trade privileges, smuggling becomes a political fact rather than merely a criminal one. Merchant houses gain from expansion and therefore help normalize it. Imperial administrators need information from merchants and thus tolerate certain corruptions while prosecuting others. The border is not merely defended, it is commercialized. And because the South already possessed deep traditions of urban sophistication, the apparatus could become remarkably elaborate. Such elaboration is often mistaken for wisdom. It is not. Complexity only means there are more parts available for use or abuse. What did this look like to ordinary people? To a caravan factor, perhaps it meant that the same stamped seal accepted in one city now carried authority in another, provided the proper duties had been paid and the proper official bribed no less than expected. To a shipmaster, it meant more predictable harbour masters in imperial ports, but also stricter inspection and deeper entanglement with state demands. To a provincial noble, it meant the chance to convert local status into imperial office, though at the price of becoming legible to a court that could elevate or destroy from afar. To a smallholder in a grain district, it meant quotas, movement of soldiers, road labour, assessments, and the unnerving knowledge that the crop no longer belonged wholly to the valley that grew it. To an enslaved labourer, it meant being counted, transported, housed, bought, sold, or bred, according to needs decided elsewhere, then made to maintain the very system that denied one personhood. To a clerk, it meant security and danger at once. The empire needed ink, but regimes with many ledgers also tend to know where to find inconvenient scribes. This is why I distrust romantic language about imperial order. Order for whom? By what means? Sustained at whose cost? Shoon's answer, like most empires, depended on where one stood when the tax roll was read aloud. Now we reach the difference between conquest and administration, which sounds to many ears like the sort of distinction only an archivist or a very tired general would bother to make. Yet whole peoples live or die inside that difference. Conquest is an event. Administration is a condition. A conquering army may burn a city, take hostages, seize treasury and temple, and depart. If it does not return in some organized way, the conquered may rebuild, adapt, resist, or proclaim continuity with selective amnesia. Administration, however, lingers. It inserts itself into calendars, roads, titles, tax categories, property disputes, military obligations, marriage alliances, and the architecture of dependence. It persuades the local ambitious that their ambitions are safer inside the imperial machine than outside it. Only then has conquest become durable. The Shoon Imperium succeeded for centuries because it learned this lesson thoroughly. It did not simply hold Kalimshan and Tether under one crown. It taught generations of elites, officers, merchants, priests, and courtiers to think imperially. A provincial notable in Tether, if sufficiently pragmatic or sufficiently compromised, might find that service to the Khizar brought roads, protection, commercial access, military command, or a title otherwise unattainable. A merchant in an outlying city might resent taxes, yet profit from imperial suppression of small arrivals or from access to wider trade zones. A court mage might enjoy patronage on a scale impossible in a lesser kingdom, at least until another ruler decided mages were suddenly the problem. A commander might discover that imperial campaigns offered not only duty, but land, spoils, prestige, and the possibility of founding a local dynasty beneath the imperial canopy. Every empire recruits the ambitious among the conquered. It could not persist if it did not. That is why conquered lands remember empire differently than the center does. The center remembers scale, magnificence, and the flattering lie of universality. It remembers the roads built, the markets enlarged, the embassies received, the ceremonies perfected, the foreign dignitaries impressed. It remembers itself as organizer. The provinces remember being organized. Tether under Shoon rule is one of the clearest cases. It had not been some tribal blankness waiting for southern refinement. It possessed its own kingship, its own clan traditions, its own political memories. The Shoon takeover was therefore not experienced as first-order civilization, but as subordination, often cunning, sometimes profitable for a few, seldom innocent. In Tether, imperial rule meant not only incorporation, but humiliation, especially when policy began to reflect the priorities of a dynastic center willing to use the land as staging ground, granary, prestige theater, and later magical laboratory. How does a realm remember that? Not only through chronicles of rebellion, through gossip about where the roads really led, through old family grudges, through songs that keep one murdered line alive a little longer, through the names of ruined estates, through a persistent suspicion that the court in the capital, whichever capital it happens to be, will always treat the region as material first and polity second. The lands that would later become Amn remembered differently still. Under Shoon, they existed in part as Western Emirates and imperial possessions, useful zones of supply, trade, and strategic control. When the Imperium collapsed, those lands did not simply vanish into political nothingness. They improvised. By 460 DR, General Esmail Torlath seized Amin and founded Amn, transforming former imperial territory into a new realm. See how that works. The empire dies, but its former districts do not return to innocence. They become successor states. The old lines of movement, habit, military organization, and extraction furnish the bones from which new polities grow. This is why failed empires are so dangerous to later historians. They linger not as corpses, but as habits dispersed into many surviving bodies. Shoon's rulers, whether brutal mediocrities or gifted monsters, benefited from this distributed continuity. When one policy failed, another office compensated. When a ruler neglected governance for magic, the army or the court or the provincial elite might continue the imperial work for its own reasons. When the capital tightened control, local collaborators adapted. When the center loosened, ambitious governors pushed outward anyway, hoping conquest would purchase favor. Thus did expansion become something more than a strategic choice. It became the expected behavior of a system trained to measure itself by movement and incorporation. Some empires continue because they still believe. Shoon, increasingly, continued because it had forgotten how to imagine prestige without extension. That is a rarer and uglier kind of durability. Belief can fail. Habit simply repeats until the world beneath it tears. Yet if I speak only of coercion, I would be lying by omission, and I have no intention of insulting you with the simplifying comforts of moral pageantry. The Shoon Imperium endured as long as it did because many people, not all of them wicked, found it useful, profitable, impressive, or even beautiful. This too is part of the record. Under some rulers, the Imperium prospered materially. Trade expanded, roads facilitated movement, cities grew, artistic patronage flourished, temples rose, libraries were built. Clergy rights withdrawn under one reign might be restored under another. Certain reigns delivered peace, or something near enough to it that merchants could plan seasons ahead instead of funerals ahead. Not every subject of the Caesars spent every day under the boot. Many lived ordinary lives beneath the imperial canopy, bought and sold goods, married, prayed, argued, made art, gossiped about the court, cursed taxes, and still conceded that the roads were better maintained than under the last local warlord. That is how empire seduces memory. Consider Amal Shoon V, remembered as a comparatively enlightened ruler who restored rights to clergy taken by an earlier Kaiser, sponsored artistic works, and oversaw a reign of peace, order, and prosperity. Such rulers matter because they become the evidence later nostalgists produce whenever anyone objects to the empire entire. They say, but under this emperor the markets were full, the roads safe, the temples endowed. They are not always wrong about the conditions. They are wrong when they treat those conditions as separable from the system that elsewhere relied on subordination, slavery, and concentrated coercion. A polished imperial age is never built from polished means alone. In the Shoon realms, wealth moved through systems already entangled with slavery, class stratification, old noble privilege, and the extraction of labor from those too weak, too conquered, or too legally diminished to refuse. The empire did not invent all these practices. Kalimshan was old, and old civilizations accumulate injustices with the same patience they accumulate libraries. But empire intensified them by scale. To run a vast capital such as Shoonach, to field armies, to maintain ports, to construct roads, to endow court life, to support magical research, to reward allies, to punish rivals, and to stage the very image of unsurpassed sovereignty. All this required an enormous and continuous draw upon human lives. Slavery, therefore, was not an unfortunate ornament of the Shoon order. It was part of its infrastructure. That fact becomes hard to ignore when one walks through the records of Mamlukar, that district of Shoonach explicitly set aside for the capital's enslaved population. I do not advise reading such ledgers after supper. They are marvels of administrative composure, tallies of maintenance labor, allocations of household servants, records of transfer, rations, work assignments, births, losses, illnesses, and the language of replacement wherever a person ought to stand. There are few sights more chilling than cruelty rendered efficient by stationery. And because Shoon sat atop older Kalishite civic sophistication, the record could be splendidly thorough. An ignorant tyranny simply destroys. A mature tyranny inventories. Daily life in the imperial center therefore contained sharp vertical divisions. The court glittered. Noble houses maneuvered. Priests performed in richly endowed sanctuaries, unless the reigning Khizar happened to resent them. Scholars, jurists, scribes, artisans, perfume dealers, architects, shipwrights, caravan factors, musicians, translators, taxmen, messengers, and minor officials all made careers within the imperial web. Beneath and around them moved the less protected multitudes, dock laborers, market handlers, field workers, servitors, caravan guards, quartered troops, the urban poor, the enslaved. Imperial prosperity is always more legible in the upper stories than in the lower courtyards. It is fashionable in some circles to speak of civilization as though it were a single moral good distributed in even measure. Nonsense. Civilization is concentration of skill, memory, wealth, institutions, coercion, beauty, and appetite. Whether that concentration produces justice is another matter entirely. Shoon produced concentration magnificently. And because it did, it could persuade later generations to mistake endurance for legitimacy. Do not make that mistake. A system may last centuries and still deserve judgment. The judgment becomes easier, though no less tragic, when we come to the necromancer emperors and the stage of the Imperium in which magical power and imperial administration began feeding one another with especially poisonous enthusiasm. Shoon IV stands as one of the clearest examples of how a realm may prosper and blacken at once. He came to the throne in 205 DR after arranging the death of his brother, and if one wishes to summarize him in a single sentence, the most accurate might be this: he was a political genius with the ethics of a grave robber who had decided the cemetery itself ought to applaud. Even enemies conceded his administrative foresight. Trade prospered under him. The Kalishar Emirates grew greatly. He allowed some neighboring non-human realms to develop without direct suppression, and according to later chroniclers, the empire copied useful ideas from those encounters. He amassed magical knowledge, artifacts, and state capacity with a kind of cold method that later scholars cannot deny without becoming dishonest. He also relied increasingly upon necromancy and the use of undead forces in state service. And here, the Shoon Imperium tells us something dreadful about bureaucracy. Once a government becomes willing to use the dead as tools, it reveals that its underlying view of the living was already dangerously instrumental. The most infamous example from his reign is the death parade of 231 DR. For years, unrest and rebellion had plagued Tetherian districts between Ithmong and Shunark. Tether had not forgotten what had been done to it, nor had all its peoples learned to love being counted, taxed, garrisoned, and ruled through southern dynastic logic. Shoon IV, after repeated attempts to suppress resistance, finally loosed undead, zombies, skeletons, wights, many created from dead slaves and villagers, upon the rebels. The revolt was crushed. Some histories report this with the sterile briskness of success. Unrest pacified. Imperial order restored. There is a place in the archives where such phrasing is filed. It is beside the shelf marked Euphemism, second alcove on the left, just below self-flattery and above military understatement. What did the death parade mean in lived terms? It meant that a subject population already taught to fear the empire's levies and prisons now had to fear conscription by death itself. It meant that the state could make an example not only of one's body while living, but of one's remains after burial. It meant that communities whose dead should have been protected by right, kinship, memory, and reverence saw those protections made politically irrelevant. It meant that necromancy ceased to be merely the tool of isolated villains or hidden cults and became something like policy. A people can endure many things, but when a government demonstrates that it sees corpses chiefly as unused resources, something foundational in civic trust is shattered. Shoon IV's reign also intensified magical research at court, especially after the seizure of a dragon's hoard in 236 DR. Many spells, items, and dangerous arcane works of the Shoon legacy date from this period. He is associated with a notorious body of magical lore, later remembered as the Necrokisaurus, and later traditions not all equally trustworthy in their details, credit him with magical work of astonishing ambition, even perhaps touching the conceptual territory of mythal craft. Here the record grows tangled. I will not grant certainty where certainty is not owed. But this much is clear. Under Shoon IV, the Imperium became a collector and generator of powerful magic on a scale that later centuries continued to feel in artifacts, spell traditions, ruined laboratories, and persistent fear. He also made an enemy of Iriklathagra, the blue dragon later dreaded across Kalimshan as the Sharp Fangs. A prudent ruler does not casually teach an ancient dragon to remember his name with hatred. Shoon IV, whatever else he was, did not value prudence above ego. When he attempted lichdom, he reportedly failed to survive the transformation, a fitting note if one enjoys cosmic irony, though the Empire did not thereby become virtuous. His great-granddaughter, Shoon V, succeeded him and proved unexpectedly capable, limiting the influence of spellcasters grown too powerful, sponsoring the armed forces and overseeing further conquests into the Shah, the Nalantha Isles, and territory upon the Chultan Peninsula. There again is the imperial pattern. One monstrous ruler dies, the apparatus remains. A capable successor rebalances, recenters, and continues. Expansion is not interrupted because the machine no longer needs the founder's personality to justify itself. It has grown into habit. Under Shoon VI, resources were again diverted toward magical power. The intelligence network improved, and the broader mechanisms of empire kept turning even as the ruler left much governance to expert visors. Observe the pattern. Whether the throne was held by an enlightened sponsor of peace, a necromantic political mastermind, a militarily competent empress, or an arcane obsessive, the system persisted. Different rulers shifted the balance among clergy, merchants, soldiers, and mages. None abandoned the underlying imperial assumption that prestige required scope. This is the danger of durable institutions unmoored from moral restraint. They can survive very different personalities because their purpose has become structural. A good ruler may steer them somewhat better. A wicked ruler may weaponize them more extravagantly. A mediocre ruler may simply coast on the tracks laid by others. But the tracks remain, and so long as they reward reach, the train continues toward distant lands it has not yet learned to misgovern. If Shoon IV reveals the union of competence and necromantic terror, Shoon VII reveals something perhaps even more instructive. The empire that has begun to consume itself because the ruler cannot distinguish control from omnipotence. By the time Kodos Win Nadim El-Jotos took the throne as Shoon VII in 309 DR, the Imperium already possessed immense administrative depth, military reach, magical infrastructure, and cultivated habits of obedience. Kodos was no fool inheriting a machine beyond his comprehension. He was a formidable archmage, trained in Almraven, seasoned in spell battles, and ambitious enough to orchestrate an assassination within the imperial family and then theatrically avenge the murder he himself had arranged. If there is a more imperial sentence than that, I hope not to read it before breakfast. From the beginning, Shoon VII sought direct and exhaustive control. He compelled the realm's leading mages, the Caleph's arcane, to swear magically enforced loyalty. Those who refused were killed. Those who consented were rewarded. The Guild Arcane of Memnon lost its leaders when they resisted, and the Caesar simply took control himself. There is no better summary of late imperial centralization than that. Expertise is tolerated only if it kneels. Institutions are allowed to survive only if they can be made extensions of one will. Understand how different this is from simple tyranny. A brute may threaten everyone equally and thereby rule badly. Shoon VII wanted detail. He wanted the subtle parts, the hidden channels, the distributed expertise, the unofficial powers that make great states actually function. He did not merely wish to be obeyed in proclamation. He wished to own the machinery by which others obeyed. Such rulers sometimes appear impressive to weak minds because they radiate mastery. In truth, they are often diagnosing the fragility of their own systems with brutal accuracy. They know that local elites, guildmasters, court mages, merchants, priests, and generals all possess forms of power the throne does not directly control. The solution of the wise ruler is negotiated balance. The solution of the paranoid ruler is total subordination. The latter is more dramatic and therefore more beloved of the sort of chronicler who has never governed even a granary without dropping half the keys. Then came the great fires of 319 DR. Crime had increased in the cities of the Imperium, particularly in the undercities and sewer networks where thieves' guilds and illicit trade sheltered. Shoon VII, when merchants complained, did not ask why urban desperation and illicit networks had grown. He did not examine whether corruption in officialdom, inequality in distribution, military predation, or court-sanctioned vice had fed the problem. He chose an imperial answer. Oil was poured into the sewers of the realm's cities and lit by magic to burn the criminals out. It worked in the sense that hammers work upon glass. The fires spread beyond control, foundations and buildings burned, entire urban quarters were devastated. Ankapur, Kalimport, Inalith, Ithmong, Memnon, cities across the empire were nearly destroyed. More than 3 million subjects died by some records. Shoon VII's response was not repentance. He judged the operation justified because organized crime had been effectively broken. Then, with exquisite moral consistency, he and his loyalists took control of much of the underworld activity themselves. There is a lesson here so obvious that later ages somehow still miss it. When a state promises to eliminate disorder by means so absolute that they destroy the city in order to save it, the state has revealed that its true priority is not civic health, but uncontested control. For the ordinary people of the Shoon cities, the Great Fires were not an abstract marker in a table of dates. They were smoke in market wards, collapsing streets, poisoned air, screams in underlevels, ruined ledgers, vanished households, sudden unemployment, mutilated infrastructure, and the knowledge that the sovereign had chosen a remedy worse than the disease. Imagine living in a city old enough to believe it had seen every mode of disaster, only to learn that the disaster was policy. And because empire had woven trade and coercion so tightly together, these fires did not simply kill. They altered commercial and political life. When neighborhoods vanish, ownership disputes proliferate. When criminal networks are decapitated but not abolished, more politically connected predators take their place. When the crown effectively nationalizes vice through loyal intermediaries, merchants, guards, magistrates, smugglers, and noble houses all adjust. The underworld, like a province, becomes something to administer. This is why Shoon VII fascinates and horrifies alike. He did not preside over imperial breakdown by neglect. He drove the logic of control to its monstrous conclusion. He believed the ends justified the means, not as a tired excuse uttered after failure, but as governing doctrine. And doctrine, once enthroned, begins seeking fresh sacrifices. Shoon VII's reign saw brutalities not limited to cities and criminals. In 355 DR, when elves of the Snakewood sought to protect unicorns from being captured and slaughtered for imperial magical use, Shoon VII sent his legions against them. Elves were killed in such number that later accounts say the headwaters of the river Rimril ran red. Captives were enslaved or subjected to grotesque magical experimentation. From the slaughtered unicorns and the bloodshed surrounding them, Shoon forged or completed terrible artifacts, including the Tome of the Unicorn and the Staff of Shoon. Here, the Empire reveals another of its habits. When it encounters sacred life beyond its immediate administrative categories, it treats that life as material. Forests become timber, elves become rebels or experimental stock, unicorns become components, sacredness becomes inconvenience, and inconvenience becomes blood. I have lived long enough to see many powers justify such conversions in softer language. They call it development, integration, rational use, security, progress. The shelves groan beneath these euphemisms. Shoon at least had the discourtesy to be blatant. And still, the Empire continued. That is the part that should trouble you most. The continuation depended, as ever, upon the convergence of many interests. Merchants still desired the market stability imperial scale could provide, even if they feared the crown's appetite. Provincial magnates still coveted titles and proximity to power. Generals still saw opportunity at the frontier. Court wizards still hoped to survive by becoming indispensable. Priests adapted unless persecuted outright. Lesser officials still processed tariffs, levies, correspondence, and legal disputes because life inside a large system develops routines that do not pause each time the sovereign does something monstrous. This is how empires teach populations to endure what should be intolerable, not by convincing everyone, by making daily continuity depend upon adaptation. Shoon VII exploited that adaptability mercilessly. He centralized authority, demanded loyalty, replaced or dominated independent institutions, and used spectacular violence to remind the realm that he alone defined necessity. Yet even he could not wholly abolish the empire's distributed nature. Indeed, one of the more revealing episodes of his reign is the rise and fall of Vashala. In the 360s, an ambitious subordinate in Tethir, Ashar Tornam, styled a Nazir of the Imperium, undertook expansive campaigns in hopes of impressing the Cuissar. The result was a dramatic swelling of the empire's northern reach all the way to the High Moor. Such a gain appears glorious on a map. It is less glorious when one asks the usual inconvenient questions. Who would garrison it, provision it, legitimize it, and defend its lines of communication? Expansion enacted for prestige, rather than durable integration, tends to create long, expensive vulnerabilities with excellent ceremonial titles. Cormyr eventually broke this northern extension, driving Imperial influence back toward the Giants' Run Mountains. But the deeper lesson is not about one border correction. It is about the way subordinates inside expansionary systems begin to think. They do not ask merely whether a campaign is wise. They ask whether inaction will be read as weakness. When the center rewards gain and speaks empire as destiny, local commanders take risks to prove zeal. Thus does imperial habit reproduce itself through ambition below the throne. Shoon VII's conflicts with Iriclathagra offer a similar lesson. He fought the ancient blue dragon in a series of titanic clashes and sustained grave injuries. Later tradition remembers the spectacle because mortals are easily dazzled by duels between infamous powers. Very well. Be dazzled for a moment if you must. Then ask what such enmities say about governance, a realm whose ruler spends energy antagonizing elder dragons, while centralizing every institutional lever at home is not merely grand. It is unstable. The very scale of the Kaiser's ego became a strategic variable. After these injuries, and amid his ongoing pursuit of ever greater power, Shoon VII embarked upon lichdom. Here I will be precise. The historical record indicates that he moved his magical research, clothed himself in illusions to conceal weakness, named his daughter heir, and prepared for the possibility of internal assassination as much as external threat. Whether one emphasizes the theatrical cunning or the desperate paranoia depends upon taste. I see no contradiction. A ruler can be both supremely cunning and trapped by the demands of his own office. What is lichdom in imperial terms? It is monarchy stripped of all remaining modesty. A king who dreams of ruling forever still admits, by the necessity of dream, that he has not done so yet. A Lich king, or a ruler striving toward that condition, attempts to abolish succession by abolishing the ruler's natural end. Every court already inclines toward the fantasy that the state and the sovereign are one. Undeath lets that fantasy harden into project. Of course, a Baelnorn can say this with particular authority. There is undeath in service of guardianship, bound by oath and memory, restrained by duty. And there is undeath in service of appetite. Do not confuse them. The difference is not cosmetic, it is civilizational. Shoon VII, like others of his type, treated mortality as an administrative defect. But even a ruler aspiring to outlast death could not fully master the slow corrosion already underway. An empire trained to serve one center must still function through many human intermediaries. Once fear becomes the dominant organizing principle, those intermediaries cease to believe the center can protect them and begin positioning for succession, autonomy, or quiet betrayal. Thus, the empire's own breadth, once its strength, becomes the territory across which distrust travels. When Shoon VII passed from the throne's immediate scene and his daughter Shani inherited, the rot deepened. Shani ruled from 367 DR to 427 DR and is remembered as vain, manipulable, and more interested in the pleasures of the harem than in governance. This is the sort of summary later histories adore because it permits them to blame collapse upon one decorative fool. The truth is both simpler and harsher. By her reign, the empire was already too dependent upon concentrated manipulation over mighty regional interests and the loyalty of generals whose allegiance could be bought. During her 60 years on the throne, nobles purchased military loyalty away from the center. Factions maneuvered. The great machine still existed, but more of its parts now answered to private interest than to Shoon. A weak ruler does not create every structural failure beneath her. Sometimes she merely reveals how much the structure depended on fear and charisma rather than durable civic legitimacy. Under Shani, the empire did not cease to be large. It ceased to be coherent. That is a more fatal wound than many capitals realize until the fires have started. The end, when it came, was not a single, clean collapse, but the kind of unraveling old empires so often suffer. Regions calculating, factions maneuvering, military men deciding that rescue and seizure look very similar from horseback. Amal Shoon VII, Shani's youngest grandchild, emerged from relative obscurity near the Lake of Steam and seized the imperial center after Shani's death in 427 DR. He retook Kalimport after weeks of fighting and reasserted Kisar authority over what remained. Had he been born to a younger empire, later panegyrists might have praised him as a restorer. Indeed, in another setting, such a figure might have succeeded. He had military ability, personal force, and the grim talent for public speech that can pass for conviction when the audience is desperate enough. But he inherited not a thriving whole, only a burned shell. This is where the metaphor of imperial afterlife becomes literal. Successor restorers often believe that if they can retake the capital, they have reclaimed the empire. Yet the capital is only the head. If the limbs no longer trust the head, retaking it proves little. Amal VII declared himself Kisar over territories already fraying, over elites already self-interested, over populations already exhausted, and over an apparatus too damaged to obey as it once had. Worse, he hated and feared magic. Now, an empire in the Shoon tradition turning against magic is rather like a ship attempting to outlaw water after years of navigating by it. The later Kisar's fear produced the Mage Purges, a long campaign from 427 DR until his death in 450 DR, in which suspected arcanists, their kin and their associates were slaughtered, driven into exile, or stripped of institutional existence. Records speak of more than 38,000 slain in the first year alone and tens of thousands more fleeing, while academies and guild houses were razed. The priesthood too was overtaxed. Specialists the empire needed were persecuted because the ruler no longer trusted the very classes of people from whom earlier Shoon greatness had drawn strength. See the pattern complete itself. The founder had been a wizard. Later Kisars had made mages pillars of the court. Necromancer emperors had forged terror and prestige through arcane mastery. Now a restorer, frightened by how much power magicians represented outside his direct control, tried to extirpate them. The empire, unable to live without its own organs, set about attacking them. Such campaigns are never merely ideological. They are administrative convulsions. Every purge dislocates property, expertise, patronage, and loyalty. Every burned academy creates refugees. Every murdered master leaves apprentices to scatter or go underground. Every terrified cleric remembers the tax collector's face. The center calls this purification. The provinces experience it as evidence that the realm has gone mad. Some later lore suggests that the flight of mages from the Shoon purges had repercussions far beyond the old imperial heartlands, seeding upheavals and new magical communities elsewhere. I believe this likely, though exact lines are difficult to prove in every case. Exile is one of Empire's most fertile legacies. Those driven out do not vanish. They carry skills, grudges, habits and warnings into the next polity willing to receive them. Meanwhile, Tethya, unsurprisingly, had had enough. Prince Strom, later Strom I, emerged as the instrument of Tethya's liberation. An elf with human blood tracing back into Tethya's own old royal identity, he represented not simply rebellion, but restoration of a local political memory long subordinated to Shoon rule. In 450 DR, he killed Amal Shoon VII, razed Shoonach's imperial city in the Great Fires of Shoonach, and effectively ended the Imperium. Ericlathagra, remembering her own hatreds, plundered the ruined capital. In Kalishite cities, nobles and military figures fought to seize what remained. Tethya crowned Strom king. Kalimshan was left to sort itself in the wake. Within a decade, the former Western Emirate of Amin had become the realm of Amn under Esmel Torlath. The map changed. The habits did not disappear. That is the point I must press until it leaves an impression. When the Shoon Imperium fell, its roads did not crumble overnight. Its former provincial identities did not dissolve into blankness. Its tax habits, noble vanities, old offices, military expectations, and memories of subordination continued in altered form. Tethya regained kingship, but the memory of Shoon rule remained embedded in its regional politics and in the very drama of what it meant to restore the realm. Amen rose from former imperial territory and built its own future from the leftover infrastructure of imperial organization. Kalimshan survived again, because civilizations older than their rulers often do, but it did not emerge untouched. Later slave soldiers, the Mamelukes, would rise in reaction against conditions left in the imperial wake. Even policy toward wizards changed partly in response to the abuses of the Shoon years. And Shoonach itself endured as ruin. Ah yes, the ruin. Not a single dead city, but a sprawling accretion of dead urban pieces. Iltakar, the imperial city, Mamlukar, Agis, Debukhir, the Fediajar, the Palace Mount, and all the cursed, trapped, haunted, poisoned, or magically contaminated spaces such a place would naturally produce. A giant carcass of state left on the land, treasure within, horror within, archives within, dangers within, the perfect inheritance for later adventurers and the perfect accusation against later simplifiers. For what is Shoonach if not the imperial thesis fossilized? Centralization, luxury, slavery, administration, magical excess, conquest, older inherited foundations, and catastrophic collapse, all visible at once if one has the discipline to look beyond the loot tables. Now let us step back from dynasties and ask the broader question this season keeps placing before us. What survives a failed empire besides its ruins? One form of inheritance deserves its own candle. Law. Not justice, you understand. Law. The paper skeleton of possession. Empires excel at producing documents that claim to settle the world. Land grants, harbour rights, water allocations, tax immunities, hereditary confirmations, temple exemptions, military obligations, debt recognitions, salvage charters, and the endlessly breeding species of decree by which a distant centre informs local reality that it has been reclassified. The Shoon Imperium, with its deep administrative reach, generated such paper in abundance. Why does that matter after the fall? Because parchment rots more slowly than legitimacy. A later lord in Tether may denounce Shoon oppression while quietly producing an old imperial confirmation of his family's estate when a neighbour contests the boundary. A merchant consortium in Kalimshan may curse the Caesars in public verse, yet retain profit from docking privileges first standardized in imperial years. A claimant in the lands that become Amn may base his right to collect tolls upon a road once surveyed for the Imperium's armies. Temples, too, may discover that rights granted by hated rulers are still rights worth defending when newer crowns grow acquisitive. Thus, the archive becomes battlefield. There are vaults. I have visited some, regrettably, where later generations preserved imperial charters not out of affection for Shoon, but because those charters could still win lawsuits. Imagine the absurdity, if you like, of an entire room full of post-imperial patriots depending for their property claims upon the seals of rulers they publicly called tyrants. This is not hypocrisy exactly. It is inheritance behaving with its usual lack of elegance. The law therefore preserves empire in a peculiarly ghostly form. Even where the banner is gone, the categories remain available. A district is still described according to an old revenue designation. A river crossing is still known by a title attached during imperial survey. A noble line still traces seniority through a confirmation granted from Shoonak 300 years earlier. The state dies. The document lingers. Then some clever advocate resurrects the dead in court and calls it precedent. You will forgive me if I laugh dryly. I have watched realms argue with their ancestors in duplicate for entire winters. This matters to adventurers as well, though they seldom realize it until too late. The old ruin one enters for treasure may stand on land whose title was never truly extinguished. The artifact one removes may technically belong, under some surviving imperial doctrine, to a temple, a noble house, or a crown that has been waiting generations for a fool to retrieve it at personal risk. The hidden cistern beneath a shattered palace may still determine downstream irrigation rights. The archive chamber, once opened, may not contain gold at all, but something far more destabilizing: proof. Gold enriches. Proof rearranges. Shoon left a great deal of both. Roads survive. We have said this already, but it deserves repetition, because roads are among the quietest and most consequential afterlives in the realms. A later merchant prince, a local king, a rebel army, a pilgrim route, a smuggling chain, or an adventuring company all benefit from roads whose builders did not imagine them as gifts. The original purpose may have been legions. The later use becomes commerce, or migration, or flight, or invasion. The stone does not care. Later, peoples inherit movement. Titles survive, not always in exact form, but enough to shape expectations. Old noble houses remember having served the Khazars or resisted them. Provincial elites retain the taste for rank. Claims once grounded in imperial appointment mutate into hereditary pretension. Local rulers justify themselves by comparison to the empire they rejected. Even the language of governance bears old sediment. A people may hate an empire and still speak some of its categories. Taxes survive in temperament, if not in tariff. By this I mean that populations accustomed to being counted, assessed, and distributed into categories do not become administratively innocent the day the imperial banner falls. New rulers inherit a society already legible in certain ways. That legibility is useful, so they keep it where they can. The collector changes. The habit of collecting persists. Class habits survive. An empire that trained local elites to seek central favor does not leave behind egalitarian provinces. It leaves behind aristocracies practiced in brokerage, households skilled in opportunism, military men accustomed to political weight, merchant classes that know how to turn instability into profit, and subject populations already divided by law, custom, and access. Trauma survives. There, at least, the empire may be relied upon for consistency. Tether remembered subordination. Kalimshan remembered grandeur and degradation alike. Slave populations remembered the precision with which they had been used. Elves remembered massacres, experiments, hunts, and the conversion of sacred creatures into arcane ingredients. Priests remembered being favored by one reign and stripped by another. Mages remembered patronage turning to pyre. Trauma does not always announce itself in royal chronicles. More often it is stored in distrust, in a region's quickness to rebel, in a people's suspicion of centralization. In the legends they tell about old capitals, in the sort of office no one wants restored, however efficiently it once balanced the ledgers. Ruins survive, of course, and with them magical contamination, dangerous relics, and the persistent temptation to raid the dead for advantage in the present. Every empire that amassed significant magical power leaves campaign fuel behind, as your modern phrase would have it, though I prefer to say it leaves unresolved negotiations between the living and the past. Shoon bequeathed artifacts, cursed sites, haunted halls, lost libraries, secrets of necromancy, and the permanent lesson that state-backed magic is often more destructive than private wickedness because it commands infrastructure. Most insidious of all, nostalgia survives. Not honest remembrance, nostalgia, the selective memory of old order, old roads, old greatness, old certainty, stripped of cost. People who never cleaned a slave district or fled a purge or saw their villages dead raised against them will tell you that in the time of empire, the trains, forgive me, there were no trains, but the sentiment persists across technologies. The caravans ran on time and the bandits kept their heads down. They will tell you that there was discipline then, grandeur, reach, respect. They will forget or choose not to know what made that grandeur possible. This too is why Shoon matters later than its dates. A failed empire becomes available to imagination in two opposite ways. To scholars and adventurers, it becomes a field of dangerous inheritance. Ruins, secrets, artifacts, buried roads, claims, and unresolved lineages. To demagogues and romantics, it becomes a usable memory. Once we were great, they say, by which they usually mean once other people were more obedient. Such language appears whenever a polity grows insecure and begins looking backward for a form of self-respect that does not require present justice. The Shoon Imperium, because it was so vast, so old by human standards, so administratively sophisticated, and so visibly ruinous in the end, offers precisely the sort of memory ambitious lesser minds love to misuse. Do not help them. If you speak of Shoon, speak of the roads and the ledgers, yes. Speak of the capital and the conquests, certainly, but speak also of Mamlukar, speak of the death parade, speak of the great fires, speak of unicorn blood boiled into artifacts and of elves butchered because a sovereign required ingredients. Speak of murdered royal lines, manipulated successions, frightened priests, fleeing mages, and provincial lives spent serving a center that remembered them chiefly in quota form. Civilizations are arguments. Empires are usually arguments shouted through infrastructure. Shoon shouted for centuries. The echoes remain. There is another lesson here, quieter perhaps, but no less important for this season's larger work. Shoon reminds us that inheritance is not a passive condition. It is a contested act of interpretation. When later Tether remembered the imperial centuries, it did not inherit a single truth. Some remembered humiliation, some remembered administrative strength. Some remembered mixed ancestry, dynastic complexity, and the return of a native line through Strom. Some remembered that the very site of Shoonak stood upon older Tetherian and even older non-human work, and thus read the ruined capital not only as imperial carcass, but as one more layer in a deeper regional history. The same stones could signify oppression, warning, opportunity, or ancestral reclamation, depending upon who spoke. When Amna rose from former imperial territory, it did not merely throw off Shoon and become unprecedented. It inherited Western Emirates, trade corridors, civic habits, military structures, and local ambitions shaped inside the imperial order. Its later mercantile and oligarchic energies did not emerge from a vacuum. They were born in part from regions already used to thinking at scale, already wired into wider exchange, already hungry to turn instability into sovereignty. Empire had tutored its successors even in falling. Kalimshan, as always, is the most difficult case because it outlasted Shoon and therefore could choose later to remember the dynasty as one episode in its older continuity. This is where ancient civilizations are most misleading to outsiders. A younger realm might date itself by a dynasty. An older one absorbs the dynasty into a much longer self-understanding. To say the Shoon Imperium in Kalimshan is to name a dominant age, yes, but not the whole identity of the civilization. Old cities learn the insulting art of surviving their rulers. Kalimshan was already skilled at that long before the first Kaisar crowned himself. Even the ruins of Shoonak participate in contested inheritance. To the treasure hunter, they are wealth. To the scholar, archives and evidence. To the local peasantry, danger and old curse. To descendant noble lines, perhaps proof of status or old injury. To Tethir, they can serve as a reminder of liberation. To Kalishite nostalgists, perhaps as a monument to lost reach. To dragons and monsters, shelter or feeding ground. To cults, opportunity. To the wise, an admonition. This is why maps lie by omission. A map labels a ruin. It does not label the argument around the ruin. A map marks an old road. It does not note how many modern claims depend upon who first paved it, who taxed it, who bled beside it, or which village remembers being displaced to clear its line. A map shows borders after the empire's fall. It does not show how tax habits, noble marriage, merchant credit, mercenary custom, and regional fear continue to ignore those clean boundaries. When the season began, I told you Faerûn is an overwritten manuscript. Shoon proves the point with almost tedious magnificence. It overwrote prior kingdoms. Successor realms overwrote it. Ruins preserved the pressure of both. Later powers inherited, denied, reused, looted, sanctified, cursed, and rebuilt. Every phase accused the previous of excess, while quietly pocketing whatever roads, walls, offices, or titles could still be made useful. Do you see now why I resist simple moral diagrams? Shoon was wicked in many of its methods. On this, the record is plain. But the lands that followed it were not purified by outliving it. They were shaped by it. They learned from it what to keep and what to denounce, though not always the same things. Sometimes they kept the cruel efficiency and denounced only the face that had worn it. Sometimes they rejected certain visible horrors while preserving the deeper class habits that had enabled them. Sometimes they turned imperial infrastructure toward more local, more modest, and therefore perhaps more humane ends. Sometimes they merely painted old walls with newer heraldry. Inheritance is never clean. If you listen closely, this is the point at which many students begin to experience disappointment. They had hoped the fall of empire would restore moral clarity. Alas, history is not obliged to provide such luxuries. The fall of empire restores contingency. That is not the same thing. And contingency in Faerûn is where adventurers are born. A land full of broken imperial roads, successor states, contested ruins, displaced elites, traumatized provinces, surviving magical relics, and local powers. Improvising legitimacy is a land that will keep producing people willing to take risk for coin, revenge, knowledge, piety, or the mere thrill of standing where the dead once insisted no one else would stand. If you ever wonder why the realms breeds so many bold fools with swords, spells, maps, and unfinished childhood issues, look first to the ruins of old orders. Shoon has supplied quite enough of those. Before we close the cabinet and move on, I want to linger over one more distinction. The difference between an empire that expands because it possesses energy and one that expands because it has lost the ability to stop. This may seem philosophical. It is not. It is practical and bloody. A young state with surplus population, martial confidence, or acute strategic anxiety may expand because its leaders believe expansion addresses immediate needs. Such calculations can still be wicked. Need does not sanctify conquest, but the motive remains legible. One can ask whether the grain shortage, border threat, dynastic insecurity, or commercial necessity was real, exaggerated, or manufactured. A mature imperial apparatus, such as Shoon by contrast, develops constituencies that require expansion or its semblance to preserve status. Generals need campaigns, or at least frontiers, to justify their standing. Merchants seek protected routes and new markets. Courtiers require opportunities to win favor through service. Lesser nobles need governorships for sons who would otherwise become domestic problems. Administrators, having organized one district, find that the techniques seem reusable elsewhere. the capital requires continued inflow of surplus to support its scale and ceremony. Priests seek broader spheres of influence, unless suppressed. Mages desire new sites, old ruins, strange resources, and state backing. Even the ideology of the regime begins to assume that stillness is decline. This is what I mean by habit. Shoon did not always expand because some fresh necessity had arisen. Often it expanded because its institutions had been trained to understand non-expansion as loss of face. In such systems, the question asked at court is not, should we? But how shall we speak our failure if we do not? That shift is fatal. Once prestige becomes dependent upon perpetual motion, prudence appears weak, caution traitorous, and local suffering negligible compared to imperial embarrassment. The campaigns into the Shah, the Nelantha, parts of Chult, the northern thrusts under over-ambitious subordinates. All these can be read not as isolated acts of strategic brilliance or folly, but as symptoms of a state whose internal rewards increasingly favored reach. Some of those conquests held briefly, some longer, some mainly in the imagination of map-makers, but together they testify to a political culture that could not think modestly without feeling diminished. We flatter ourselves in every age that our own grand projects are uniquely rational. Then we leave behind ruins explaining otherwise. A Kaiser declares that a distant province is necessary for security. A subordinate launches a war to prove fidelity. A merchant house funds the enterprise and acquires monopolies. A road is cut, a fort is raised, taxes increase, local resistance deepens, more troops are required, rituals of incorporation are performed, the court celebrates, songs are commissioned, the province yields less than expected. Another campaign follows. A new district is created. An archive chest acquires another set of seals. Meanwhile, in some village, the old boundary markers are uprooted, the shrine is rededicated, the language of official petition changes, and a child grows to adulthood believing empire the weather. That is how history becomes ordinary. Then one day the center weakens, the tribute fails to arrive, the troops mutiny or redeploy, the governor declares independence, and the province everyone had called securely imperial remembers itself otherwise almost overnight. Later, historians gasp at how quickly great powers fall. They should instead wonder how much local memory had been waiting just beyond the reach of the garrison. Shoon, for all its centuries, never abolished the possibility that Kalimshan was older than it, Tethir older than its subordination, and the Western Emirates ready to become something else, once the center no longer frightened them sufficiently. Imperial habit, then, contains its own doom. The more it treats incorporation as normal, the less carefully it distinguishes durable possession from intimidated compliance. It begins to believe its own maps. Never do that, my apprentice. Maps are records of claims under temporary conditions. They are not guarantees written into the bones of the world. The bones in Faerûn are older than empires and less impressed by them. Shoon also offers a warning about the relationship between beauty and violence, a theme I find myself returning to because the realms returns to it with such indecent frequency. Some listeners, especially those drawn first by the atmosphere of old ports, southern courts, silk markets, processions, and the grave splendor of imperial ruins may feel tempted to romanticize the Shoon age aesthetically. This is understandable. The south can be ravishing. Palaces, minarets, carved screens, perfumed halls, river quays, lamplit gardens, ceremonial steel, veiled diplomacy, and archives written in flowing hands across dyed vellum. Yes, yes, it is all very beautiful. Beauty does not acquit. In fact, the more beautiful the imperial surface, the more diligent one must be in asking what labor, discipline, hierarchy, and silenced pain made it possible. The Shoon capital's gardens were enclosed not only to delight the eye, but to stage rank. Its streets were planned not merely for grace, but for control. Its administrative records were not simply examples of sophisticated literacy. They were instruments by which people were counted into usefulness. Its magical court was not admirable because it was learned. Learning under patronage can become cruelty with better penmanship. I say this not to reject beauty. I have preserved too much of it to pretend indifference. I say it because one of the laziest forms of historical corruption is the assumption that refined cultures are therefore morally superior to the rougher peoples they dominate. Shoon was refined. It was also monstrous in recurring ways. Tetherian rebels, rural clans, border peoples, forest communities, dwarven inheritors beneath older stone, and even underworld dwellers within the cities all suffered from that refinement when it turned stateward. Silk may cover a lash without softening it. This is one reason I prefer archives to court performances. The archive eventually reveals the scaffolding. Somewhere beneath the illuminated epic praising a Caesar's triumph sits the requisition for grain, the casualty total, the levy order, the account of confiscated lands, the quiet legal revision that strips a priesthood of privileges, or the warehouse inventory whose numbers rise after a district's population declines. Beauty tells you how power wished to be seen. Records tell you what power had to do in order to afford being seen that way. Shoonash, again, is exemplary. A splendid capital built atop older foundations, fed by enclosed labor, supplied by fields and ports yoked to its needs, and planned to present imperial inevitability. One can imagine the sight of it in its height, the palace mount above, the imperial city spread below, the river traffic moving, fountains lifted by ancient pumps, officials gliding through chambers, banners shifting in hot wind. Magnificent. And below or beside all that, Mamlukar. That is the necessary sentence. Whenever you behold a masterpiece of statecraft, ask where its Mamlukar is. There is always one. Perhaps not literally a district bearing so blunt a name as Slave's Village, though empires are occasionally honest in their geometry, if nowhere else. But there is always a place, a class, a labor pool, a dispossessed people, a confiscated hinterland, or a terrified profession whose compression makes the center possible. This insight will serve you well in every age of the realms. When you later hear of a noble city in decline, ask what burden once upheld its brightness. When you hear of a restored realm, ask whose restoration is being celebrated and whose continuing displacement is being omitted. When you hear of a stable kingdom, ask what roads and tax habits from an older empire it still relies upon while publicly denouncing the dead. The answers are rarely simple. They are nearly always illuminating. Shoon, being less subtle than some, provides excellent training material. I can almost hear from here among the shelves the objections some would make. But Irillion, they say, though usually with less courtesy and poorer diction, surely you are being unfair. Did not the Shoon Imperium also create possibilities? Did not roads bind distant regions together? Did not trade flourish? Did not libraries rise, cathedrals receive patronage, and arts prosper? Did not successor states inherit useful structures from all this? Yes. And that is precisely why one must speak carefully. A thing may create possibilities and still deserve condemnation for how it created them. The roads are real, the markets are real, the artistic patronage is real, the administrative sophistication is real. So are the slave districts, the purges, the undead terror, the massacres, and the fires. The proper response is not to deny one half in favor of the other. It is to hold both long enough to understand the relation between them. Useful inheritances often arrive wrapped around injuries. That is true of families. It is true of kingdoms. It is true of empires. One inherits an old road and also the tax logic that first justified it. One inherits a great city and also the class order that maintained it. One inherits archives and also the priorities of the state that produced them. One inherits a capital ruin and also whatever magical contagions, opportunistic legends, and salvaged ambitions seep from its stones into later centuries. This is one reason Season 2 delights me so much. It denies the listener the comfort of beginnings. Everything here is second order. Jamdath grew where other peoples had already lived and where later peoples would continue after it. Mulhorand and Unther arose from stolen peoples and divine rescue, then hardened into ancient states themselves. Chesenta and Chondath inherited the Vilhon after Jamdath's fall and transformed water, memory and commerce into new rivalries. Kalimshan absorbed conquests without losing civilizational continuity. Shoon then took that continuity and imperialized it. Nothing begins cleanly. Nothing ends cleanly. The Realms is not a gallery of sealed episodes. It is one long dispute among inheritances. And because it is, later adventure becomes possible. Why does some ruin in the lands of intrigue contain both dwarven engineering, imperial records, necromantic residue, and evidence of later scavengers? Because Shoon did not build on clean earth. Why does a merchant prince in Amn care about an old Tetherian claim? Because imperial borders once overrode local memory and later left the paperwork in inconvenient cupboards. Why does a noble in Kalimshan speak proudly of civilization while saying very little about the labor arrangements that supported certain ancestral estates? Because old prestige survives by selective narration. Why does a dragon treasure some hatred particularly toward a human realm? Because emperors once mistook draconic memory for a variable they could manage. Why do adventurers keep finding artifacts of alarming power in the south? Because court mages under imperial patronage had centuries to produce alarming things and insufficient ethical supervision in which to do it. You see, the dead do not merely leave ruins, they leave causal chains. The burden of the law warden is to keep those chains visible long after the banners have rotted. That is why I dislike empty nostalgia. It cuts the chain at the point most flattering to the nostalgist. And that, in case you wondered, is a kind of lying. Let me give you, before we part, a more intimate sense of how imperial habit settles into everyday life, because large histories too often flatten the scale at which actual people suffered, adapted, or prospered. Imagine first a clerk in Shoon, the son of a minor household from Kalimport, sufficiently literate to copy tariffs and levy notices, sufficiently ambitious to hope one day for a post more visible than a records room, but not so ambitious as to invite immediate assassination. He rises before dawn because the office requires early access to seal traffic from the grain districts. He spends the day comparing counts from the Fediajar to requisitions from the palace kitchens, correcting a discrepancy in military ration allotments, and quietly deciding whether to report a shipping irregularity that implicates a patron whose cousin can ruin his career. He lives inside empire, not as an idea, but as paperwork. Its survival means his wages, status, and prospects. If he is intelligent, he learns to hate certain policies privately while serving them publicly. That too is inheritance. Imagine next a woman in Tether whose family once held local importance before Shoon appointments displaced them. Her husband serves as intermediary between imperial officials and regional landholders because outright refusal would mean confiscation and perhaps a more brutal appointee replacing him. She keeps family memory alive through stories told correctly at supper, through the preservation of old names, through a shrine maintained even when the official cult at court is favored more heavily, through the subtle instruction of children not to admire the Khizar too much. If open rebellion comes, one son may join. Another may remain, because someone must keep the estate from being seized. Resistance in such households is not always a trumpet. Sometimes it is a carefully rationed continuity. Imagine a caravan master in a Western emirate, later part of what becomes Amnan. He curses imperial road tolls while knowing perfectly well that the road itself has made his business possible. His profits depend upon the stability provided by garrisons he despises, and his household's future depends on exploiting markets opened by a crown he distrusts. When the Imperium weakens, he is among the first to calculate whether loyalty is still profitable. Men like him are why successor states rise faster than romantics think possible. They have been preparing alternative loyalties for years. Imagine an enslaved mason in Mamlukar, transported from elsewhere, counted and reassigned as construction or maintenance requires. The imperial capital to him is not the source of law or the theatre of glory. It is dust in the lungs, overseers with tablets, ache in the arms, the knowledge that fountains shine for those who do not build them. And perhaps, on certain evenings, the whispered stories of where he or his parents came from before the transfer. The state exists in the scar, not the proclamation. Imagine a court mage under Shoon VII after the loyalty oaths. Patronage is immense, resources unmatched, libraries rich, laboratories well-funded. One can do things here impossible elsewhere. One can also die if suspected of independence. So one learns the late imperial art of brilliance under duress, produce wonders, flatter precisely, conceal some findings, declare some research impossible until one knows which faction will survive, and never forget that the ruler who praises arcane mastery today may burn the academy tomorrow under his grandson. That kind of life breeds powerful magic and weak ethics in equal measure. Imagine a priest after Amal VII's anti-magical and anti-clerical pressures begin tightening. Tithes are watched more closely. Temple rights are negotiated against tax demand. The court that once endowed sanctuaries now eyes them as autonomous wealth. Sermons become cautious. Some clergy conform. Some shelter fugitives. Some quietly begin thinking of regional loyalties before imperial ones. Again, the empire falls first in the souls of intermediaries. I give you these lives not to indulge sentiment, but to correct scale. History is not only the Kisar and the rebel prince. It is the clerk, the noble widow, the caravan master, the slave, the mage, the priest, the porter, the shipwright, the perfumer, the barracks cook, the child who grows up learning the imperial calendar and later must relearn a local one when the banners change. When a polity lasts 4 centuries, it enters people's sense of normal. Its collapse, therefore, does not free a blank slate. It releases millions of habits into a new order. This is why the question, what survives empire, can never be answered only with ruins. The people survive too, though not unchanged. And they carry the empire onward in gesture, vocabulary, aspiration, fear and appetite, long after its capital has begun admitting bats through the roof beams. There is one final irony in the Shoon story that I would be negligent not to preserve. For all its boast of order, the Imperium remained dependent upon what it could not wholly domesticate. It depended upon older foundations. We have seen this in Shoonach's very site and waterworks. It depended upon provincial memory, even when suppressing it, because provinces provide labor, legitimacy, and troops only so long as they remain socially coherent enough to be ruled. It depended upon magic it never fully trusted. It depended upon merchant networks whose calculations were always partly independent. It depended upon dragons not taking too active an interest. It depended upon priests it alternately privileged and squeezed. It depended upon slaves whose labor could be coerced, but whose humanity could not be erased from the hidden record of the realm. It depended upon roads whose very usefulness made later secession possible. It depended upon the illusion that the center's vision and the world's reality were sufficiently aligned. No empire can eliminate all exteriority. Something always remains outside or beneath the chart. A forest spirit, a dragon's long grudge, a local kinship network, a rival market, an older shrine, a buried waterwork, a rebel memory, a new merchant class, a province that has learned the imperial language well enough to use it against the center. Shoon teaches this with unusual clarity because its apparatus was so elaborate and its ruin so complete. The very tools of its greatness, infrastructure, magical concentration, distributed administration, cultivated elites, became, in altered circumstances, the conditions by which others survived it. This is why I do not despise ruins. I distrust what built many of them, yes, but the ruins themselves are honest. They no longer flatter their makers with functioning pomp. They present consequences. A slave district in ruins is still accusation. A dead palace still confesses appetite. A poisoned well still remembers policy. A necromancer's laboratory, no longer disguised by court ceremony, looks precisely as obscene as it always was. Ruin can therefore restore proportion. That, perhaps, is the strangest mercy history sometimes offers. A living empire can command language, law, heraldry, and punishment strongly enough to force many people to speak well of it. A dead empire loses that privilege. Then the stones may begin saying what the edicts did not. If you ever walk Shoonak, and I advise against doing so casually, sentimentally, or with companions selected chiefly for enthusiasm rather than caution, remember that you are not merely entering a dungeon. You are entering an exposed argument about empire. Every collapsed corridor, every haunted archive, every sealed cistern, every district whose function can still be inferred from its layout is part of that argument. Bring rope, wards, water, perhaps a priest of reliable disposition, and above all, a mind unwilling to be dazzled into stupidity by scale. Scale is not innocence. The bigger the ruin, often the larger the bill the past left unpaid. So what, then, is the Shoon Imperium's place in the larger story of Faerûn? It is not the first human greatness. Jamdath gives us another model, psionic and civic. Mulhorand and Unther give divine state continuities of astonishing durability. Imaskar before them gave planar arrogance a continental laboratory. Netheril later will make magic into infrastructure on a scale that still intoxicates the reckless. But Shoon offers something particularly instructive because it is neither wholly singular nor wholly alien. It is recognizably imperial in a way many listeners, knowingly or not, will understand at once. That makes it dangerous. Familiar patterns seduce more effectively than exotic ones. Shoon shows how a rich old civilization can be imperialized through family, office, and habit, rather than by one dramatic founding alone. It shows how conquest and administration intertwine, how roads outlive armies, how slave systems scale under centralized demand, how capitals confess political purpose in their layout, how mages become state organs and then targets, how provinces remember differently than courts, how necromantic terror can coexist with material prosperity, how beauty can be built atop enclosed suffering, and how a fallen empire continues through successor states, ruins, nostalgia, and dispersed institutional memory. That is a great many lessons for one dynasty, which is perhaps why the shelves devoted to Shoon are so very heavy. It also anchors the southern-western half of this season. Without Shoon, later Amn and Tether are flatter stories. Without Shoon, Kalimshan's later convulsions are easier to misread as merely local instability rather than the aftershocks of imperial overreach layered upon older civilizational continuities. Without Shoon, you miss how the South's roads, classes, magical fears, and political reflexes were shaped by centuries in which expansion became routine and office became appetite. And without Shoon, one understands less of Faerûn's favorite recurring phenomenon, the state that outgrows its virtue before it outgrows its confidence. I have lived through more than one version of that. Perhaps you have too, if only on a smaller scale and with worse furniture. Now the questions remain, as they should. What does a conquered land owe the infrastructure that later sustains it? When a later kingdom uses an imperial road, is it preserving wisdom or carrying forward the assumptions of domination? How much of a civilization's beauty can be admired honestly once one sees the district built to house the unfree. At what point does a state cease to expand because it must, and begin to expand because its elite no longer knows how else to measure importance? And when a ruined capital still shapes politics centuries later through roads, titles, treasure, fear, and dreams of restoration, has the empire truly ended, or merely changed from government into haunting? These are not rhetorical ornaments. They are tools. Keep them close. The website at taleofthelich.com remains open, and the archive there continues to grow for those who would like the timelines, notes, and associated materials gathered where they can be handled without needing to bribe a chamberlain, flatter an imperial vizier, or descend personally into any district once named for its slaves. This is, I concede, an administrative improvement. The dead are sometimes capable of modernization when properly harassed by necessity. Merch is coming soon as well. I remain uncertain whether history has truly prepared me for the existence of practical household items bearing meditations on imperial taxation, necromantic bureaucracy, and the moral hazards of planned capitals. Yet if such objects send even one curious soul toward the archive with better questions than the average conqueror asked, perhaps the embarrassment may be endured. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If you require a digital structure that can survive growth without collapsing into a maze of contradictory permissions, ornamental confusion, and later regret, seek builders who understand long-term systems better than the Shoon court understood restraint. Durable design is not glamorous until the glamorous alternative catches fire. Next time, we move from empire to its neighboring heirs and wound-bearers. We will enter Amn and Tether, coin and blood, merchant sovereignty and noble failure, two adjacent realms shaped profoundly by Shoon's afterlife, yet determined to become themselves. There we shall see how wealth seeks legitimacy, how bloodline fails to guarantee peace, and why flawed states produce the precise conditions in which smugglers, mercenaries, adventurers, opportunists, and would-be saviors proliferate like mold in a neglected charter room. Come ready for intrigue. Empires leave ruins. Their successors leave excuses. Until then, keep your candles trimmed, your ledgers skeptical, your admiration under discipline, and your maps annotated wherever a broad border has been mistaken for consent. I am Aurelian Cantonine. This has been the Lich's tale. And remember, ruin is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting is what happens when the living inherit an imperial road, rename it after themselves, and call the destination destiny.